When a reader opens your story, they're in a black box. They cannot see, hear, taste, touch, smell. They stay in this black box until you've given them a new world to see. Today, I'm working from my home office. The wall behind me is off-white with a large square portrait of Audrey Hepburn because I love old Hollywood and Audrey was one classy Hollywood actress. The desk my computer sits on is an IKEA white desk with a set of side drawers. The top of the desk is covered with pen cups overflowing with colored pens, stacks of papers to grade, stacks of work to be done, and overflowing file folder of notes for my current novel. The cat, so there's the pens, the cat sits in his box beside my desk, only speaking when he's hungry or thirsty. The dryer down the hall fills the house with warm white noise, a rhythmic metallic click sounds at the top of each rotation. Below me, the click, click, click of the dog's nails on the wood floor tells me he's pacing, wanting me to go downstairs. The smell of coffee wafts up the stairwell and mingles with the scent of dryer sheets and fabric softener. The air is warm, finally spring, so the window is open, letting in a soft breeze. Outside, the neighbor kids, their siblings, race their bikes around the cul-de-sac. Later today, after school and work, the boy across the street will play remote-control cars with his dad. I wonder if he's lonely without a sibling to play with, or if he's thrilled to have his dad all to himself. This is the special world around me, and until I invited you inside, I was talking in a void. Well, it's important to start a story in media res or in the middle of things. It's also important that you ground your reader into your world. Whether you're writing realistic fiction, mystery, suspense, science fiction, or fantasy, your special world interests the reader or they wouldn't be here. So how do you build a world they want to visit? Today, we're talking about world building, and while all writers use setting and the special world of some sort, the focus today is on speculative fiction, which is science fiction and fantasy. There are many theories on world building, and so the first thing I want to say is my general disclaimer: use what works for you and ignore the rest. We're going to start with a short clip from Brian Sanderson because I think that it encapsulates a lot of the basics before we get into specifics.
Where's our original? That's at least my take on it. The iceberg. So, conventional wisdom about world building is this idea that world building is done like an iceberg. That this is what you show in your book, and this is how much you know. It's a good place to start our discussion of world building, because one of the reasons that people read epic fantasy in particular, but all fantasy and science fiction, is this idea that they want to be immersed in a new place. When Dave taught this class, and I took it all those years ago, he mentioned the fact that the biggest movies of all time consistently shared this idea that they took people to a new time and place. Whether that place was, a plantation during the Civil War, or Tatooine, they were all doing very immersive experiences, taking people to another time and place. And if you go look at the top 20 box office hits of all time, you will see consistently that the majority of them share this: new time and place and an immersive setting. People go into stories like this, like we usually write, wanting to believe that it's real. And this iceberg theory is one way that you can approach this. If you've listened to the Lord of the Rings commentary by actors and directors, they mention that all the actors were given elven underwear to wear. The elves were. They all were wearing, elven underwear that never appeared. You couldn't see it. It was all covered up, but they were still all wearing elven or elvish, Tolkien scholars, you can tell me which it is, underwear. This iceberg philosophy is the idea of the elven underwear. even though it's not going to appear on screen, your job is to convince the reader that everyone is wearing elven underwear. Okay? Now, the iceberg is one way to do this. The iceberg philosophy is you extrapolate. You spend a lot of time and you build yourself a nice world book. And you are then able to answer some of these questions about your culture and setting so that as you're writing, the reader gets the sense, oh, the author is several steps ahead. I believe that this is real and the characters are living in a world that exists beyond the page. There are a couple problems with that. Number one, if you're a discovery writer, you might say, that sounds an awful lot like outlining and I don't like that. That's okay. Actually, a lot of discovery writers just write this as they go, and then they later on fill in a bunch of this after they finish their book, and then they do a rewrite that makes sure that this part is kind of, the iceberg part is kind of visible under the water a little bit, if that makes sense. This is a good method for a discovery writer to not get paralyzed by the idea that you have to do all of this. You say, wow, Brandon writes the Stormlight Archive. Look at how much work goes into that world. He's mentioned before that he's got like 400,000 words of world building. That means I can't even start my book until I've done 400,000 words of world building, and after I do like 20,000, I'm bored of the book and need to move on. That is not necessarily the way you need to approach this, okay? The idea is that you need to give the illusion that there's an iceberg there. You don't actually have to have an iceberg. One way to do it is to have the iceberg, and it is a legitimate way. If you enjoy that, if it makes your storytelling better, then yes, you can make the iceberg, though pay attention next week when we talk about how to not do this accidentally. Right? Where the reader's like, oh, wow, you've got such an iceberg in this book. Everything is iceberg. Wow. Okay? That's the problem with having an iceberg, is that oftentimes you want to show it off. You want to be like, I've got an iceberg. Here's the whole thing. And that's real boring, real fast in a fantasy novel.
All right. So a lot of really great things in there. And one of the things that Sanderson mentioned is the need for, I think he called it a world book. I've heard it called a book Bible or a series Bible or a universe Bible. I apparently were fascinated with the word Bible. But they're essentially a place to keep your notes about your special world. This helps you maintain continuity as you write the book or series. You can use a Microsoft Word document, a spreadsheet. I do a spreadsheet for all the characters that I have in an ongoing series so that I don't inadvertently give somebody a characteristic or mannerism or physical appearance that they didn't have previously. You can also create a universe wiki, and yes, indeed, you can create your own wiki. Google that. It's super cool. But be forewarned that this kind of thing is a time suck, so be careful. It's sort of like going on Pinterest to find an actress or model who looks like your character, and 15 hours later, you still don't have anything picked out for your character. You can also use worksheets from an app like Scrivener to help you build your world. That's actually one of the best parts about Scrivener, from what I understand. And then there's some sites that you guys talked about previously in class, World Anvil and Notebook.ai. Whatever you use, beware of going too deep below the surface on your iceberg. If you watch the full Sanderson video, he talks about people who've spent years, a decade building their world. And if you want to be, I shouldn't say all, but if you want to create a world because it's cool and you love it, that's great. Build your cool world. But most writers want somebody to read it at some point, which means you have to move away from this research world building mode into writing mode. We've talked in the past about plotters and pantsers, and one of the things I really like about the Sanderson clip is that he calls pantsers discovery writers. It seems a lot less derogatory to me, and what a great phrase to say, hey, I want to discover the world with my reader. So it honestly doesn't matter if you do the planning up front as you write. Just make sure that you don't write yourself into a corner. And one of the ways to avoid writing yourself into a corner is don't make too many rules. The more creative you can become as your story develops, if you let the discovery process work for you. So if you start out that there's some hard rules about magic or the universe that you're in, you could end up writing yourself into a corner that you cannot write yourself out of, and then you have a lot of revision. So your book Bible should be a place to give general details while still leaving you room for your characters and the world to grow. Think of an ancient mariner map that ends with the line, "Here there be dragons." Let the characters discover the world around them, and they don't have to know everything about the world. Where is your lens? So use the lens of your point of view character, and you're going to notice the things in this new world that your character would notice. So if flying dirigibles are a normal part of the world, your character might not notice them. If you were writing a detective mystery in the real world, the detective, or in actually a special world, the detective would notice clues or other pertinent details. But a person living in the special world isn't going to stand back and notice everything cool and wondrous and surreal about the world because they live in that world. It's normal for them. So don't info dump as the character walks through their village or town or city or planet. Instead, think about what your character would notice. Sanderson said that you should give enough detail to convince the reader that there is an iceberg, but you only have to develop the elements beneath the waterline if that interests you. Dole out the information carefully as it becomes part of the story. And once it's in the story, then it has to go in your book Bible so it maintains consistency throughout the book or series. So no matter what your genre, the goal for starting a book is to start in media res, in the middle of things. And in science and fiction fantasy, if you start in the middle of an intense moment, you can develop your character and the conflict and then add more details about the world as your story progresses. Think of Harry Potter. Rowling starts in a very ordinary world of a boy who lives under the stairs. I mean, given that living under the stairs is abnormal, but it's normal in his world. The world expands first with suggestions that weird things happen around Harry. The demonstration of what happens with the snake goes a little bit further. Then we have the owls, before finally Hagrid shows up with the announcement, "You're a wizard, Harry." The entire opening of the first book, the reader is joining the new world and discovering its cool attributes, along with the not really a muggle, but new wizard, Harry Potter. So one way to expose or explore your new world is with a character who is unfamiliar with the special world. And a lot of times in fantasy you see this, where you have a character who has to leave his city or his vale or his planet for some reason, and so you're experiencing the special world with that character. How do you grow your special world? Several of the suggestions that I've read is that you pick 3 or 4 special world elements that are the most interesting to you. And here in a minute, I'm going to go through several slides with some questions for you to ask about your special world. But you don't need to know or display or share every single one of those. Pick 3 or 4 and focus on those, the ones that are the most interesting to you, or in the same way that you might know more about your character than shows up on the page, you may know more about the world, and you want to focus on the world elements that impact your character and that are of interest to you. So there's no reason to go into politics, for instance, of this new world, unless the political situation puts the character in danger, or maybe that political intrigue or international intrigue is of interest to you, and so that would be something that you would include in your special world. Place. Sanderson says, and I agree, I've read this in several places, don't front load all of the special world, right? Don't overload the reader with a bunch of proper names that will confuse the reader. These are all new things. You don't need to name drop a bunch of stuff. There are things that you probably have to know about the world if there's certain place names that are important, but don't front load it in that first scene or that first chapter. Place is important, is maybe one of the most important elements of science fiction fantasy. Where are we? What is it called? And how did we get here? Well, it's not necessary to know that there are 2,357,051 Acadians in your world. It is a good idea to give the reader a sense of the population. Is it urban or rural, overcrowded or sparse? Topography is equally important. So, what does it look like? Is it a tropical island, a rainforest, a desert? Is it a place with 3 moons and 5 suns? What does the world look like? What place are we in? Where do we come from? One of the it's a human need to know origin stories. We need to know where we come from and where we're going. And sometimes that can tie into the religion of a place. But first, consider, where did this cool new world originate? Where did its people come from? This can lead to conflict later, if you choose to go in that direction, or it might be something that ultimately unifies the characters in your story. It's your universe, so where did these beings come from and where are they going? Part of origin of a place leads to mythology. So if you look at the mythology of any culture, Greek mythology, Native American mythology, almost all mythologies have an origin story. And so mythology is uniquely tied to this. What myths do they have? What stories do the people in this world tell? What gods bring them to obedience? What folklore or superstitions do they exhibit? And yes, what kind of gods do they have, if any? What are their religious beliefs? What holidays do they celebrate? If you look at U.S. history, most of our holidays come to us either from religion or elements of our world, such as victories or accomplishments. So Memorial Day remembers those who have died at war. Independence Day is a celebration of a victory. So what holidays do your world people or world beings, what holidays do they celebrate? And this can be something that develops or evolves over time in your story. It may not be pertinent when you first start out, but in book 3, it may be important. Next, we're going to look at their culture. So what is their style? Are they wearing middle-age attire? Do they have pyramids, hot air balloons, horses, dragons? What does the cultural world look like, dress like, and feel like? And this may not need to be fully visible, but it will be visible as your characters interact. You can layer this as something familiar with something new. So you can have clothes like steampunk that is a blend of modern and past. What is the language that the culture uses, and what unusual terminology do they use? Remember, one of the keys is not to info dump a bunch of pronouns onto the reader, so we don't need to know the names of everything on page 1. But these things should be layered into the story as your characters interact with the culture. Their terminology and their language is different, or is it the same as ours? Sometimes it's more simplistic to leave it the same if that's not something that interests you. Tolkien developed new languages, but some of us don't want to spend time developing language. So what terminology or language elements do you want to include? Things can get messy if you try to juggle too many languages in every conversation, and that's true if you're writing just regular contemporary fiction. If you have multiple people speaking a different language, it adds complications. So having one base language would make things easier on everyone involved, but you have to decide, what is this language? Oops, one more. How do they keep time? Do they have years and months and seasons and days? What is it they have? In the Hunger Games, time is tracked in days, but in Alice in Wonderland, time is compressed and expanded depending on the scene, and the same thing with her size as relative to the other characters in the piece. Does the world have seasons like ours, an annual calendar? Based on what? You build off of normal and layer in the unusual. So maybe a full year like our calendar, but days are longer because it takes longer to get around their sun, or the days are shorter because their orbit is shorter. What technology do they have? Are they medieval when it comes to gadgets, or are they like our contemporary world, or are they futuristic? What is their level of technological development? Remember, technology isn't necessarily a progressive or positive thing. That depends on your world. Oh, government. Um, Depending on the author and what interests the author, government and politics are oftentimes play a big part in these special worlds. So the politics of this world come from so many angles based on their origin stories, right? And if you have two beings who are on the same planet who have a different origin story, different holidays, different religion, that impacts their politics, right? Part of the political makeup is to decide if the people in your world are democratic. Are they factions by region or by type? Or, like, do we have ogres and giants and fairies? And is that the way that it's set up? Is a ruling government a family, a group, a democracy, or a different type of government? Are there conflicts between these groups? Is there conflict between the government and the religion? Who speaks for their gods? And then look at the division of power, which is kind of related to the form of government, but also ask yourself who's behind the ruler, who really runs things. If you look at historical figures and historical kings and queens, oftentimes there's somebody behind the scenes pushing the buttons. What type of economy do they have? Do you see thriving businesses, technology, or do you see bartering and medieval markets? What kind of money do they have? Is it universal in their world or different for each faction? Oh, let's get into people because people are interesting, right? What are some of their prejudices? Who is other in their culture? Who is a part of the larger group that is responsible for the othering of a particular group, which is essentially stereotyping and creating different castes, if you will? Are the characters mainstream or other? In other words, if you have characters in this world, are they outsiders or insiders? Deeper prejudices tend to crop up as you get into the details of the book. For now, just have some sort of understanding of how these groups interact and if there are prejudices between them. What are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the world and or its people? So their weakness could be an overdependence on, like in our world, it could be an overdependence on oil, right? That's a weakness. But a strength could be maybe a sense of community or unity. What unifies and divides in your culture that you're creating, and what makes them a strong group or a weak group? Do they have a history of war? Again, this may not interest you, and so this may not be something that you choose as one of the things you want to focus on in your story. But wars and conflicts are often based on a need, such as we're starving, or greed, we want what we want and you have it, or is it an ideology or religious belief? Is the conflict in the past or is it ongoing? How does the conflict impact the culture, if at all, right? So in the Hunger Games, the war, if you will, happens between 12 youths from the different factions, right? And it only impacts the culture once a year-ish. So what's the fallout of past war? And is that the seed for the conflict that you're growing with your book? Who are the surrounding people? So surrounding countries or peoples, and what are the relationships between them? Do they interact at all? What type of relationships do these different countries or factions have? Are they allies? Are they enemies? Who are these other people? What other mainland countries are there? What cultures, histories, languages, and styles, and how deep do you want to go into that? Oh, magic. Magic's fun, right? Magic varies by book and by series, and as you're creating your world, you can use or avoid magic. You can make it as simple or complex as you choose. If you think about Harry Potter, magic was just sort of hinted at in the first part of the first book, but the magic system grows as Harry grows and is exposed to his education. and he learns more about magic, and it becomes more complex as the series goes on. You can make the magic in your world as simple or as complex as you want. Does the local religion focus on magic, or does it want to destroy all magic creatures? Is magic inherent in the creature, or does it need to be conjured? Does it need magic herbs, a wand, a broom? What is the source of magic in this world? Nothing with magic is ever simple. Okay, so we're going to practice world building, and you can use our class character or another character that you've created in a special world. I'm going to read to you the first prompt, and then we'll go forward as time allows. And then if we don't get to all of them, I'll just give them to you so that you can work on them on your own time. So our first prompt is about a blind explorer, and it's designed to help you figure out more about your world. So put the point of view on a blind explorer in this special world. You are now the point of view character. You pause for a moment to gain a better understanding of the place. What do you smell? What do you taste? What do you feel when you reach a hand out? What sounds surround you? How would you describe the culture of the new land without using sight?